Hello, thank you for joining the 5 Minute Bible Study. Today we're going to be in the book of Matthew, and we're starting out this new study right now. As always, we want to go ahead and get a context of what we're about to do. So today, the context is going to be on the entire book of Matthew. Since we're not reading a verse today, we're just going to look at the book itself. As we look at the book of Matthew, we call it a gospel. It's one of four gospels in the Bible. A gospel basically tells us the story of Jesus. And so Matthew is the first gospel. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in the Bible, it's the first gospel. Back in the day, the early church fathers believed it was the first gospel that was written, which is probably one of the reasons why we see it first in the New Testament. Today, we don't actually, a lot of scholars don't believe that. A lot of scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel that was written. And it's interesting because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are come together to form what we call the synoptic gospels, the synoptic gospels. So what that means is that we look at these gospels together. That's what synoptic means. Look at them together. So we see them together. And when you read these gospels, you notice that there's a lot of similarity in them, not just even in the stories they tell, but even in the words they use to tell the story. So what we recognize is that they have this connection. And the problem we have is we don't know how that connection was made. We don't know when and where it was made. So there's a lot of questions about the synoptic gospels. We call that the synoptic problem. So when we look at this today, most scholars believe that Mark was written first. So if you ever look at Mark, it's much shorter, it's much tighter, it says a lot less. But then Matthew and Luke were written afterwards, and the thinking is that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, and that's why those three have so many things in common. What's interesting is then there's things that are in common with Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark. So the question is then how those two get things in common? And the answer that scholars have come up with today is that there's a fourth source, and they call it Q. Q is short for Quell, which is the German word for source. So they call it Q. So we see that there's these three gospels and that there's this Q. And the thinking today is that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke were written sharing Mark, but then Matthew and Luke also shared Q for the things that they have in common that isn't in Mark. And that's the thinking today. That said, back in the day, in the early church believed Matthew was written first and that Mark and Luke borrowed from him. So there's no need for Matthew to have an extra source because he's the source. Bottom line is, we don't know. So different scholars believe different things. Even today, modern scholarship, there are modern scholars that believe that Matthew was written first. So we don't know. And for our purposes, it's not overly important. We just want to recognize that those three do have very similarities. They are synoptic. So we do look at those three together. And oftentimes we'll see something in Matthew. We can go back to Luke or to Mark to get more about it or see what else is going on. So it's an important way for us to study the Gospels when we go through those. Matthew, by the way, in the early days, the early church fathers didn't only think that it was the first gospel, but they thought that it was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, one or the other. And we don't have that. We don't have any original manuscripts in the Aramaic or the Hebrew. We don't have any early copies of the gospel in Hebrew. So today scholars do not believe that it was written in Hebrew or in Aramaic, but that it was written in Greek. There's certain reasons for that, and especially if you believe that Mark was written first, you see that Matthew then uses the same language that Mark does. If Matthew was writing in Hebrew, why would he, write in? Why would the Greek be so exact to Mark? So things like that are hints that Matthew's writing was originally in Greek. So we believe that Matthew was written in Greek, even though the early church fathers, some of them at least, believed that it was written in Hebrew. Now, with that, we recognize that Matthew is written to the Jews. The Gospels are definitely have different audiences, and Matthew's written to the Jews. So as Matthew writes, there's a lot of Jewishness in it. We see that his genealogy only goes back to Abraham. It doesn't go back to Adam. We see that he doesn't say the kingdom of God. He says the kingdom of heaven, because he doesn't want to use the name of God, because the Jews wouldn't have appreciated that. They did not use the name of God. So Matthew honors that by calling it the kingdom of heaven instead of kingdom of God, and other things that we see. But that said, Matthew also recognizes that the Jewish prophecies mentioned the Gentiles as being part of the body at one point, and so Matthew includes that. We see he talks about the centurion's slave. We see he talks about the Canaanite woman and her daughter. We see that at the end of the gospel, he has the Great Commission to go out to all nations. So we see that he includes the Gentiles, but it's certainly written to the Jewish people as evidence of what Jesus did, but also as an apologetic, as proof, as we talk about who Jesus is. He wants to defend the faith for the Jewish people. And so he uses many Jewish quotes, a lot of quotes from the Old Testament, 61 of them to be exact. So we see a lot of that in Matthew. So that will get us started. We had an idea of who Matthew was writing to, when he was writing, probably before 70 AD. We get an idea of the Synoptic Gospels and how those came together. So we have a little bit of an idea about the Gospel now. Starting tomorrow, we'll go ahead and begin in verse 1 in chapter 1. So if you have any questions about the book of Matthew, go ahead, put them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for joining me today. God bless you.